This is a man who has influenced millions of people throughout history. We have this idea, absolute power corrupts absolutely, but Marcus is the exception to that rule. And so I thought I'd sort of walk through how to read it. I'd walk through some of my copies. Hey everyone, we're here to talk about perhaps the most incredible book ever written. One of the most magnificent expressions of human greatness, human vulnerability, self-awareness, and self-reflection. I'm talking about Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. This is a book published in 170 AD, not even actually published, written in 170 AD by the most powerful man in the world. And unlike essentially every other book ever written, this was a book never intended for publication. This was a book for the man's own edification. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor of Rome, is sitting down at night writing notes to himself about how to be a better person, how to think better, how to manage his temper, control his appetites, deal with the stresses, the inherent stresses of his position, and to thrive despite all this adversity and difficulty. That's ultimately why this book has resonated. As the American philosopher Brand Blanchard writes, few now care about the marches and countermarches of the Roman commanders. What the centuries have clung to is a notebook of thoughts by a man whose real life was largely unknown, who put down in the midnight dimness not the events of the day or the plans of the morrow, but something of far more permanent interest, the ideals and aspirations that a rare spirit lived by. That's just beautifully put. And what we're going to talk today about is how to read that book, because it's not easy. Again, unlike most books which are written for the audience, this book was written for the writer. And so somehow, magically, this book survives historically. He never wanted it to be published. He'd be mortified that we're talking, yet a chain of torchbearers preserves this wonderful work after his death, and generations have been digesting it and consuming it and being changed by it ever since. It's really an incredible list of people who have loved it. Theodore Roosevelt takes Marcus Aurelius with him on his deadly River of Doubt expedition. General James Mattis, former Secretary of Defense, 4-star general, carries Marcus Aurelius with him while he's on deployment. Wen Jiabo, the former Prime Minister of China, has read it over 100 times. Beatrice Webb, the inventor of collective bargaining, the social activist from the 1800s, she refers to Meditations as her manual of devotion. J.K. Rowling is a big fan. There was an ESPN piece about Nick Saban, perhaps the greatest football coach of all time, and this is the headline of the piece: Marcus Aurelius helps Nick Saban prep for the Trojans. Robert Louis Stevenson says, no one can read Meditations and not be moved. You carry away with you a memory of the man himself, as though you had touched a loyal hand and looked into the brave eyes and made a noble friend. And John Stuart Mill, who writes on liberty, puts in that book about Meditations that it is the highest ethical product of the ancient mind. I've got a few of them, as you can see. This is a copy of the book from the 1700s. Russell Brunson gave it to me, the founder of ClickFunnels. This is a very old, I think this is a sheepskin copy. I feel guilty even holding it. This is a copy from 1899 that someone sent me. It's really little. It's translated by J. Potter Briscoe. This is a copy from 1894. You can even see someone wrote the date of the book in here. It's pretty cool. This is a copy from also the 1800s, Thoughts of Marcus Aurelius, translated by George Long. And then this is my favorite translation, the Marcus Aurelius Gregory Hayes Modern Library Translation. Robert Fagel says, here for our age is Marcus's great work presented in its entirety, strongly introduced and freshly, elegantly translated. I cannot state this enough. Do not just buy the random cheap translation on Amazon. Don't read the free translation on the internet. There's a huge difference between these accessible translations, these modern translations, and the ancient ones. If you lived in 1870, a lot of these things would make total sense. The idioms, the thous, and the arts, but you don't live in there. You should get it as accessible as possible, because Marcus Aurelius was writing it in an accessible way. He was a man writing to himself. His journal was designed to be accessible to him. It should be accessible to you. As an example, one of the things that hit me hardest the first time I read Meditations was Marcus's verse, which opens the beginning of Book 5 of Meditations. And he's talking about struggling to get out of bed in the morning, which you may relate to. Certainly I did. This is Marcus Aurelius writing to himself in a translation here from 1899 about struggling to get out of bed in the morning. In the morning, when thou risest unwillingly, let this thought be present. I am rising to the work of a human being. Why then am I dissatisfied if I am going to do the things for which I exist and for which I was brought into this world? Or have I been made for this, to lie in the bedclothes and keep myself warm? But this is more pleasant. Dost thou exist then for thy pleasure and not at all for action or exertion? Dost thou see the little plants and little birds and the ants, the spiders, the bees working together to put in order their several parts of the universe? And art thou unwilling to do the work of a human being? And dost thou make not haste to do that which is according to thy nature? You don't have to be a genius to understand what's happening there, but, bedclothes, what the hell does that mean, right? Thou art unwillingness, dost thou, come on. So let's look at book 5 of Meditations via Gregory Hayes. At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I have to go to work as a human being. What do I have to complain of if I'm going to do what I was born for? The things I was brought into this world to do? Or is this what I was created for? To huddle under the blankets and stay warm? But it's nicer here. So you were born to feel nice instead of doing things and experiencing them? Don't you see the plants, the birds, the ants, the spiders, the bees going about their individual tasks, putting the world in order as best they can? You're not willing to do your job as a human being? Why aren't you running to do what your nature demands? This idea of stillness, you might think of Marcus as the Western philosopher, but there's some eerily Buddhist Zen themes in here too. The idea of being free of passion, the sort of idea of apatheia, to use the Greek word, ataraxia, to use the Epicurean version of that. It's about getting to a place where you're free of passions, where you're not ruled by your drives and your fears and your worries. You're still. Marcus Aurelius talks about being the rock that the wave crashes around and the ocean falls still beside. Talks about reaching that place of utter stillness. He says about being like the sphere. You could tell that he was someone who was bounced around a lot, who had racing thoughts, who got worried, who was stressed, who was frustrated.
Helen Hansel was able to win any competition she took part in. She was known as the contest queen because she had won 7 trips to Paris, boats, houses. She would basically take part in any sweepstake she read about, any contest, and she would just win. That made my documentary crew, and I asked Helen, how do you do that? And she spoke about this thing called the Silva technique. Helen, you see, was Jose Silva's former PR manager. She had the benefit of learning closely from that man. Now, Jose Silva was a radio repairman who lived in the border town of Laredo, Texas in the 1940s. He had 10 kids, and his kids were not doing very well in school. Now, Jose Silva had a crazy idea. You see, he had served in the U.S. Army, and he was fascinated by the psychological questions that the Army psychologists would ask new recruits. So he decided to look at psychology and then look at what he knew about radio repair and figure out how he could change the mindset and the brains of his kids so they could do better in school. As a radio repairman, he knew that if you reduce the resistance of a wire, more electricity flows through it. So he wondered, what could I do to reduce the resistance in the human mind? He decided to experiment with reducing any form of resistance in his children's brain. He experimented with biofeedback. He experimented with hypnosis. And sure enough, his children's grades started improving at school. But then something astonishing happened. He was sitting down with his daughter Isabel, reading a history book and asking Isabel questions. So he would guide Isabel into a restful state of being. She would have her eyes closed. He would read her the important dates. She would be able to absorb that, and then he would ask her questions. But something strange started happening. Isabel was able to answer a question before he verbally spoke it. Now let me explain this. He would think of the question in his head, a question such as, who was the 16th president of the United States? Before he could verbally say it, Isabel would answer the question, Abraham Lincoln. Jose Silva was mind blown. And so he wrote to Professor J.B. Rhine at Duke University. J.B. Rhine was famous for his research into a concept called ESP, extrasensory perception. And Silva told Rhine, Doctor, I think I trained my daughter to have ESP. J.B. Rhine replied back in a letter and said, no, that's absolutely not true. No one can be trained to have this. Your daughter must have been born with it. Jose Silva disagreed. So he continued training the rest of his kids to develop a high degree of intuition. So now over the next 10 years, Jose Silva trained 39 Laredo children on this approach. He documented the results. He made everything hyper precise, and he proved JB Rhyme wrong. This was a trainable skill. But then adults started noticing, and adults started coming to him in Laredo, Texas to get trained. Jose Silva decided to call this approach the Silva Mind Control Method. And what happened next was astonishing. A man wrote in a newspaper how after learning Silva